Wild bobcat crashes a wedding ceremony. When the bride sees him, she collapses in tears. Everyone was staring at her, waiting for the moment she'd dreamed about since she was a child. But all she could do was freeze. Her legs locked, her breath caught in her throat, and the bouquet in her hand slipped to the ground before anyone could stop it. Because just ahead, standing at the very edge of the aisle, between the altar and the rows of stunned guests, was a bobcat. It wasn't someone's pet. This was no trained show animal. Its coat was ragged, its paws dirty, and there was something wild in its eyes. It shouldn't have been there, not in the middle of a wedding ceremony, not surrounded by chairs and candles and trembling violin notes, and yet it wasn't growling, wasn't attacking, wasn't confused. It was just staring directly at the bride. The groom stepped forward first, instinctively trying to shield her. One of the groomsmen yelled for someone to call security. Chairs creaked as guests stood in panic, but the bride didn't move. Her face had drained of all color. Her hand covered her mouth, and her eyes. Her eyes were locked on the animal like she was seeing a ghost. "No," she whispered, barely audible. "No, it can't be." The bobcat didn't flinch. He didn't look afraid. He just sat down, calmly, right in the middle of the aisle like he belonged there. His ears twitched. Once and then his tail wrapped around his paws. That's when she collapsed. The crowd rushed toward her, voices overlapping. The groom dropped beside her, trying to catch her head before it hit the ground. Someone ran to call for help, but she wasn't unconscious. She was crying. No, not crying. Sobbing, shaking. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of her dress, her voice cracking in disbelief. "It's him," she said. Oh my God, it's really him. No one knew what she meant. No one knew what to say. The bobcat hadn't moved an inch. The groom looked around, confused, panicked. Who? What is she talking about? But no one could answer, because no one knew the story behind the tears. No one but her. They had to pause the ceremony. Chairs were being shifted, guests led back into the reception tent while murmurs filled the air. A few people snapped photos, thinking it was bizarre or somehow staged. But Leah, still on her knees in the middle of the grass, didn't move. Her white gown was stained at the hem now, her hands shaking, her mascara running down her cheeks. And all she could see was him. The bobcat hadn't left. He sat silently in the aisle, watching her like he'd come for a reason, and she knew deep in her bones that he had. The groom, Michael, was doing his best to make sense of it all. Pacing, asking questions, trying to maintain control. "Leah," he whispered, crouching beside her again, "you're scaring everyone. Please, just tell me what's going on. Who is this animal?" She turned to him slowly, her eyes hollow and glassy. "When I was 15, she said, voice raw. "I was left alone in the woods for 3 nights. That silenced him. The story wasn't something she shared, not even with Michael. Most people knew a sanitized version. She'd gotten lost during a hike with a youth group. Search parties found her. She was okay in the end. But the truth was much darker, and it had stayed buried with her for years. Until now. It was supposed to be a trail walk," she continued, her voice gaining steadiness. "Just an hour. I didn't think anyone would take the wrong path, but I did. My phone died. I had no compass, no water. I didn't even realize how far I'd gone until it was too late to turn back." She remembered the panic, the darkness that came so fast in the forest, how the cold slipped under her clothes and made her limbs shake. She'd spent the first night crying under a tree, too scared to sleep. By the second, her lips were cracked, her throat raw from screaming for help. She remembered thinking she might die there, that no one would find her. And then he came, a rustle in the bushes, and out walked a young bobcat, barely older than a cub, but big enough to be dangerous. She'd frozen, heart pounding, certain she was about to become prey. But he didn't attack. He simply stood there, watching her. Then he lay down a few feet away, curled into himself, and fell asleep. "He stayed with me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For 2 nights he never left. He didn't come close. He didn't let me touch him. But he was there. And somehow that made me feel like I wasn't going to die. Like something in the world still cared. On the 3rd morning, a helicopter passed overhead. She ran into the clearing, waving her arms, and they found her. Rescuers never saw the animal. By the time they arrived, the bobcat had vanished into the trees, but Leah never forgot his eyes. That quiet watchfulness. The strange, sacred way he'd made her feel safe when no one else could. Now, years later, standing on what should have been the happiest day of her life, she was staring into those same eyes again. "I never told anyone," she said finally, looking at Michael, "because no one would believe me. But I knew it was him the second I saw him." Michael didn't speak. The guests had started to gather again, cautiously watching from a distance. Zoo authorities had been called, but the bobcat still hadn't moved. It was as if he were waiting for something. Not afraid, not restless, just patient, like always. Leah stood slowly, brushing off her dress, eyes locked on the animal. "I think he came to make sure I was okay, to see the ending." And deep down, she feared it wasn't just about her happiness, but about letting go. Leah stood just 10 feet away, heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her wedding dress swayed gently in the breeze, but everything else, the guests, the murmurs, the muted footsteps of staff scrambling to respond, faded behind a strange silence between her and the wild creature in front of her. The bobcat hadn't budged. He sat still, breathing slow and calm, but his gaze never left hers. She had never imagined she'd see him again, let alone on this day in this place, surrounded by people dressed in silk and suits. And yet, there he was, just like before, showing up when she was at her most overwhelmed, most uncertain, like he could sense it. A small voice tugged at the edge of her memory. That terrified 15-year-old version of herself. That lonely girl crouched beside a tree, bruised and dehydrated, whispering into the darkness, "Please don't leave me." And he hadn't. Now Michael hovered close, unsure whether to interrupt. "Leah, are you sure this is real?" His voice was low, careful, the kind people use when they're not sure. "Whether you're imagining something too painful to process, I'm not crazy," she whispered. "I know how it sounds, but I know that face, those eyes." The tension among the guests was starting to shift. Some had their phones out. A few were asking if animal control had been called. The wedding planner was speaking quickly into a headset, her hand on her forehead. But no one dared approach the bride now, not when her hands were trembling, not when tears streaked down her cheeks, not when even the animal seemed to be waiting. Michael took a step back, not out of fear, but out of trust. "Then talk to him," he said softly. "Whatever you need to say, say it." Leah nodded once. Her heels sank into the soil as she took a cautious step forward. The bobcat's ears twitched. His shoulders tensed, but he didn't move away. She crouched low to the ground, the white fabric of her dress pooling around her like snow. She didn't reach out. She knew better. She just let her voice meet the still air between them. "I made it out," she said. "You stayed with me when I thought no one would. You kept me alive." Her voice caught. "I've never forgotten you. Not one single day." The bobcat blinked slowly. His body remained motionless, but there was something in his expression, some softening, as if he understood, as if he'd known it all along. "I don't know why you came back now," she continued, voice shaking. "But if you needed to see that I'm okay, if you needed to see me standing, you came to the right place." Her voice cracked at the end. Something about speaking the words aloud felt like a release she hadn't realized she needed. She'd carried that story inside her for years, like a secret too fragile to name. But here he was, her silent witness to pain, now a witness to her. Joy! Then, just as calmly as he'd entered, the bobcat rose to his feet. The crowd instinctively stepped back. But he didn't look at them. He looked at her, one last time. There was no roar, no sudden movement, just a gentle blink, a flick of his tail, And then he turned, disappearing into the orchard behind the ceremony. No hesitation, no looking back. Michael was beside her in seconds. "Are you okay?" Leah let out a breath that trembled on the way out. "I don't know how, but I think I am now." She glanced toward the trees. The space he had left behind felt quiet, reverent, as if even the forest knew something sacred had just happened. The reception was delayed by nearly an hour. Most of the guests were understanding, some even fascinated, but there was a weight in the air that no amount of champagne could lift. People kept whispering, wondering if what they saw was real. A few speculated it had been staged, an elaborate twist or symbolic gesture by the bride, but those closest to Leah could see the truth in her expression. Her eyes weren't sparkling with drama or performance. They were red-rimmed, swollen from tears, and still distant, like part of her was somewhere else entirely. She sat in a quiet corner of the bridal suite, staring at the edge of the woods through the open window. Her hands were clasped tightly. In her lap, the tips of her fingers paled from pressure. Michael stepped in quietly, closing the door behind him. He didn't say anything right away, just sat down beside her, resting his hand gently on hers. "I should be happy," she said finally. "This should have been the happiest day of my life." He nodded. "It still can be." She turned to him, tears quietly welling up again. "You don't understand. That animal, he's part of the reason I'm even here. I never talked about it because it sounded insane. I didn't think anyone would believe me." "I believe you," Michael said softly. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone, least of all me." Leah hesitated. "When I was rescued, I remember the search and rescue guy asking if I'd seen wildlife. I told him I hadn't. I was scared they'd think I was imagining things. I didn't even include it in the official report. But I kept a journal afterward. I wrote down every detail I could remember. I even sketched him. That was my way of holding on to it." Michael smiled faintly. "Do you still have it?" She nodded. "In my nightstand." There was a soft knock on the door. It was Leah's sister, holding something in her hands. "You said it was important," she said, handing the worn leather notebook to Leah. "I found it in your drawer." Leah opened it slowly, flipping through pages of memories. Her handwriting was smaller then, unsure. There were sketches, rough but honest. And then she reached the page that mattered most, one she hadn't looked at in years. A sketch of a young bobcat curled under a pine tree, alert but calm. Underneath it, one sentence was scrawled in shaky ink. "He stayed with me when no one else could." She passed the notebook to Michael, watching as he read it. His thumb hovered over the page, then gently smoothed it flat. "He remembered," he said. "After all this time." Leah exhaled slowly. "Do you think animals know when we need them?" Michael looked at her, his voice steady. "I think some do. I think this one did." The rest of the evening unfolded. Slowly, tenderly, the ceremony resumed, not with grandeur but with grace. Guests returned, a little quieter now, more curious than celebratory. Leah walked down the aisle, not with music but with silence. There were no cheers, just a room full of people who had witnessed something beyond explanation. When the officiant asked if she was ready to proceed, Leah smiled through her tears. "I've never been more ready." But deep down, she knew she wasn't just marrying Michael. She was honoring a piece of her past that had waited patiently for closure. And now, with the weight lifted and the truth finally shared, she could breathe again. The ceremony went on, but the emotional current beneath it was unlike anything anyone expected. Leah stood in front of Michael with steady hands now, but her voice cracked as she said her vows. There was no rehearsed poise, no perfect delivery, just raw honesty and tears that wouldn't stop falling. And when they kissed, it wasn't just a celebration of love. It felt like the closing of a chapter she'd been trapped in for years, but something still tugged at her. Even as the music played and people clapped and the sun dipped lower over the vineyard, she couldn't shake the feeling that the bobcat hadn't just come to say goodbye. There was more. something she hadn't understood yet, and she couldn't rest until she did. After the reception dinner, while the guests were dancing under string lights and laughter filled the air again, Leah slipped away. Her white heels dangled from her fingers as she walked barefoot across the edge of the property, back toward the grove, where he had vanished. The air had cooled, the trees casting long shadows over the grass. She didn't expect to find him again. Not really, but she needed to try. The path wound into a thicket of trees, the ground soft beneath her feet. She followed the trail in silence, her heart pounding in her chest for reasons she couldn't explain. A few minutes in, she spotted something on the ground, fresh paw. Prints in the dirt, unmistakable, still sharp around the edges. Her breath caught. She followed them. Then she saw it, not the bobcat, but something else, a small, half-covered bundle of cloth nestled under a fallen tree. At first glance, it looked like trash, maybe something discarded by a hiker, but as she stepped closer, her stomach flipped. It was a child's jacket, muddy, torn at the sleeve, and beside it, 2 smaller footprints. Leah crouched down, her hands trembling, her mind raced. The bobcat had come through here, the prints were fresh, and now this, a twig snapped behind her. She turned sharply, but it wasn't the bobcat. It was a park ranger, an older man with grey hair and a quiet, surprised look in his eyes. "You shouldn't be out here," he said gently, stepping closer. "Are you the bride?" She nodded slowly. "You saw him too?" The ranger's face changed. "You mean the bobcat?" "Yes," she said. "He came to my wedding. He walked down the aisle like he was trying to tell me something." The ranger looked down at the child's jacket and sighed deeply. "You might have just helped us solve a missing person case." Leah blinked. "What?" He explained that earlier that morning, a mother had reported her 5-year-old daughter missing. She had wandered away from a picnic area near the woods. Search teams had been combing the forest since noon, but hadn't turned up anything solid. "We were about to call it off for the night," he said, "until you walked right into the trail she might have taken." Leah looked again at the ground, her heart in her throat. You think he led me here?" The ranger didn't answer right away. He just looked out into the woods with quiet wonder. "I've worked this land for 27 years. Seen wild animals do strange things, sure, but a bobcat calmly walking into a wedding and then disappearing toward the one spot where a child might be lost, that's more than strange." They radioed the search team. Minutes later, flashlights lit up the grove, voices calling through the trees, and then an answer, a small cry from deeper in the woods. The search team followed the sound, pushing through brambles and branches until they found her. A little girl, cold and scared but alive, curled up in a hollow under a tree, and right beside her, half buried in the leaves, were more paw prints. The same prints Leah had followed. The ranger turned to Leah, stunned. He stayed with her. Leah pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes burning with tears, just like he did with me. Leah stood just outside the ranger station, her gown slightly torn from the underbrush, her bare feet streaked with dirt. The stars had come out, blinking faintly through the canopy of trees, casting a soft glow on everything below. In the distance, she could hear the search team returning, their voices low, careful, full of awe. The little girl had been found, alive, safe, and not alone. That was the part no one could quite explain. When they carried her out, the girl clung to the ranger's shoulder, eyes wide and silent. She was shivering but alert, blinking against the floodlights and crowd. Paramedics checked her while her mother wept, collapsing to her knees in relief. There was celebration, of course, joy, disbelief, but no one could ignore the other set of tracks leading to the hollow where she'd been found. Paw prints, fresh, as if something or someone had guarded her until help arrived. The bobcat was gone again. Leah watched all of it from the tree line, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She hadn't said much. There wasn't much to say. What could you say when a wild creature who saved your life as a child returns years later to do the same for someone else? When the impossible isn't just a memory, but a living, breathing A force moving through the world in quiet defiance of logic? Michael stood beside her now. He hadn't pushed her with questions. He'd simply followed, supported, and stood witness, and now he gently reached for her hand. Was that where it happened? He asked softly. Leah nodded. It was close. Different trees, but the same stillness, the same feeling. They stood together in the silence for a long time, not just husband and wife, but people forever altered by something unexplainable, something deeper than coincidence, something wild and ancient. Eventually, the head ranger approached. He was holding a folded blanket the girl had been wrapped in. He paused a few feet away, nodding respectfully. "She's asking for you," he said to Leah. "She told us she remembers a woman in white standing in the trees." Leah blinked, surprised. "She saw me?" The ranger nodded. "Right before you called us. She said she wasn't scared anymore. She said, he told me the girl in white would come." Leah's breath caught. Her heart clenched so suddenly she had to lean into Michael to steady herself. "He told her?" The ranger's voice softened. "I don't pretend to understand it, but she believes it, and so do I." They led Leah to the emergency tent, where the little girl was sipping warm juice from a paper cup. Her cheeks were flushed now, her lips no longer trembling. She looked up when Leah entered. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the girl reached out, a small hand. "Thank you for coming." Leah knelt beside her, unable to stop the tears this time. "You're the brave one," she whispered. "He stayed with you, didn't he?" The girl nodded. "He didn't talk, but I knew I was safe. I wasn't scared when it got dark. He made the night feel small." Leah pulled her into a gentle hug, holding her like she was holding her past, her younger self, the one who'd been too scared to speak, the one who had thought no one would ever believe her. And now, here she was, cradling a child who knew the truth before anyone else could. Later that night, after the girl had been taken to the hospital for observation and the crowd had dispersed, Leah walked once more to the edge of the forest alone. The grass was wet with dew, the air heavy with the scent of pine and earth. She stood still, closed her eyes, and whispered into the darkness. "I saw her. She's okay. You did it again." There was no answer, no rustle in the leaves, no glowing, eyes staring back, but Leah didn't need them. She knew he was out there, somewhere, watching, protecting. By morning, word had spread across the county. Local news picked up the story. Lost girl found in forest with bobcat tracks beside her. Experts were interviewed. Biologists tried to explain territorial behavior, coincidences. But no one could explain the girl's calm. Her story about the guardian who said help was coming, or the fact that the same bobcat had appeared uninvited at a wedding miles away just hours before the girl had gone missing. Some people believed, some didn't. But it didn't matter. Leah believed enough for all of them. Weeks passed. Life resumed. Leah and Michael moved forward, stronger than ever, but on quiet mornings, she'd sometimes sit on the back porch, eyes scanning the tree line. She never saw him again, not directly. But every now and then she'd find a paw print in the dirt, just one, perfectly clear, as if to say, "I'm still here, and I still remember." She'd smile softly, place her hand over the print and whisper, "So do I." And that was enough. Enough to remind her that some bonds go beyond explanation, that protection can come in the most unlikely forms, that the wild has its own way of showing love, and that sometimes, once in a lifetime, a bobcat can walk into your story, not to be feared but to save you, and if you're lucky, he'll come back to save someone else too.